3 rounds of high-level meetings between Russia and the West this week. The two sides are no closer to compromise over de-escalation on the Ukrainian border. The Russians expressed frustration that the United States had not responded to a series of demands that include Ukraine never joining NATO and rolling back NATO activities in Eastern Europe. Washington says these demands are non-starters and that Russia could be laying the groundwork to fabricate a pretext for an invasion. So what exactly is Moscow's endgame? Kremlin's longtime spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has been by Vladimir Putin's side for 2 decades, one of his closest aides. I talked to him on Friday in an exclusive interview. Mr. Peskov, pleasure to have you on, sir.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Why has Russia brought these proposals? Some people would say, why has Russia created this crisis now? Many of the things that are being talked about, the Russian demands, the draft negotiation, these are issues that have been around for a few years. What has happened in the last few months or for a few weeks that has caused this to become a kind of urgent crisis, with Russia massing more than 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border? Has something changed very recently?
Well, it all started with the beginning of the 90s, when Germany was reunited, and when the then Soviet Union and the Soviet Union leader, Mr. Gorbachev, said okay to that. There was a promise by American side, unfortunately not fixed in a legally binding guarantee document, but there was a guarantee that NATO would never expand its military infrastructure or political infrastructure eastwards. Unfortunately, the opposite thing started to happen since then, and NATO's military infrastructure started to get closer and closer to the borders of the Russian Federation. The United States started to deploy different weapons, different launching systems, and so on and so forth, closer to our border with each year. These all led to the situation when we started to feel endangered by that, and our national security was in danger. So what you have mentioned is not a story of the last couple of months or couple of weeks. It's a story of couple of decades, when NATO, and by the way, NATO is, in our understanding, it's an organization that was tailored and was created for confrontation, not for defense. And NATO is not a dove of peace, and not a dove of stability, and not a dove of prosperity. NATO is a weapon of confrontation. And this weapon of confrontation, with each year, started to get closer and closer to our borders. And after 2014, when a coup happened in Ukraine, Ukraine started, and Ukraine actually has said that it would be oriented more closer to NATO membership. At first they were just words, but with the time being, we have seen the gradual invasion of NATO into Ukrainian territory, with its infrastructure, with its instructors, with supplies of defensive and offensive weapons, teaching Ukrainian military, and so on and so forth. And that brought us to the red line. That brought us to the situation when we couldn't tolerate it anymore. And that was the main reason for President Putin to say, guys, this is a real threat for us, and this is a real threat for stability and security in European architecture. Let's find the way out. let's produce some guarantees for us. Let's think about returning NATO's military infrastructure back to the borders of 1997. Let's get rid of the idea of Ukrainians' membership to NATO, and also let's get rid of the idea, let's abandon the idea of deployment of any offensive weapons on the territory of Ukraine next to our borders. This was the main idea, the main proposal of President Putin. So we are quite a big country, and we are too big and we are too important to keep silence against this danger. So that was the main reason.
So let's talk about the proposals. As you say, the core of it does seem to be about Ukraine's potential membership in NATO. And I'm wondering if there is a possible compromise here. Russia does not want Ukraine to become a member of NATO. The truth of the matter is Ukraine is not likely to become a member of NATO anytime soon. NATO runs by consensus. You would need 30 votes. Clearly, those votes do not exist. And yet, NATO has a policy of what it calls an open door, which is it does not, in principle, rule out that any country might apply to be a member. Is it possible to imagine a compromise where, in effect, there is a statement that says there is no present plan for Ukraine to become a member, but we don't rule out that at some point in the future that might happen for Ukraine as for any other country? Is there a potential compromise there?
Well, there is also space for compromise, excluding some principal concerns. And here we're talking about principal concerns. Russia has never had a deficit of political will for negotiations. To the contrary, President Putin was willing all the time, and he is willing negotiations with NATO, with the United States, based on mutual respect and readiness to take into account each other's concerns. So NATO, you're talking about open doors policy for Ukraine, but you cannot create a security of one country at the expense of the security of the other. So there is an understanding of indivisibility of security. And it is extremely important, and we have to find out a combination to solve this problem, taking into account concerns of Russia. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. We had these 3 sessions of negotiations. There are some understandings between us, but in general, in principle, we can now say that we are staying on different tracks, on totally different tracks. And this is not good, and this is disturbing.
And we will be back with more of my interview with Vladimir Putin's longtime aide, Dmitry Peskov. And we are back with the Kremlin's chief spokesman, Dmitry Peskov. Mike McFaul, the former ambassador to Russia, had a series of tweets where he said, here's my list of demands from the Russians, since the Russians have made demands for NATO. And they read, I'm just going to read them to you, and I want to get your reaction. Russia agrees to withdraw its forces from Moldova. Russia agrees to withdraw its forces from Georgia, renounce recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Russia agrees to withdraw its forces from Ukraine, return Crimea to Ukraine, stop supporting separatist forces in Ukraine. Russia agrees to withdraw the Iskander missiles from Kaliningrad. What's your reaction to those?
So we have Russian peacekeepers in various regions, and in those regions, situation is still very still very, very fragile, and potentially the withdrawal of Russians can lead to inflammation of new crisis. We don't know what can be the outcome and what can be the situation with Abkhazia or with Ossetia, for example. And people of Abkhazia and Ossetia can be endangered by Georgian nationalists, like it happened when Georgia unleashed a war against Ossetia, sending tanks against peaceful population You have to remember it. And Russia will never discuss with anyone withdrawal of any missiles and any weapons from Kaliningrad, because Kaliningrad is a territory of Russia. And with all the due respect, we will never tolerate any demands for us to do this or that on our own territory. None of the countries will tolerate.
What about
Just imagine.
What about from Ukraine's territory? What about de-escalation in Ukraine?
Yeah, de-escalation in Ukraine. Well, first of all, there are no Russian troops in Ukraine. There are no Russian troops in Donbass. There are Russian troops on the Russian soil, on the Russian territory next to Ukrainian border. It's quite understandable.
You know, international observers say that there are Russian troops not wearing Russian uniforms, but there are Russian troops in Donbass.
There are no Russian troops of Donbass. I'm a spokesperson to Kremlin, and I officially can tell you that there are no Russian troops on Donbass and on Ukrainian soil. But there are Russian troops on the territory of the Russian Federation next to Ukrainian borders. And we find it necessary to keep those troops there in front of the very tense situation and very unfriendly environment created by various training of NATO jet fighters, NATO spy planes, NATO's military infrastructure moving towards our borders. We have to respond. We have to take measures of precaution. That's why we have our military guys on our territory there.
Do you have some kind of a timeline that you are, at which point you will then say the negotiations have failed, and are you then prepared to take military action?
Well, we're not speaking about military action. This is, you have to understand it. No one is threatening anyone with military action. This will be just a madness to do that. But we will be ready to take counteractions. So if you continue to say that, listen, Russians, we're not going to take into account your concerns. NATO will continue to expand. Now we're not going to have Ukraine inside NATO, but with the time being, it's legally it will be possible. We're not going to say that we will not deploy any offensive weapons on Ukraine's territory, and NATO's military infrastructure will stay next to your border and will even with the time being get even closer. If you tell us that, we will have to do something. What is the timeline? What is the timeline? Well, of course, we're not speaking about tomorrow, we're not speaking about hours. But what was meant by our president is that we don't want to see a process for the sake of the process. So we don't want to see a month-long or year-long negotiations discussing our disagreements. We want to feel, for the beginning, the readiness to take into account our concerns. Right now, unfortunately, we failed to do that.
Next on GPS, I will ask Dmitry Peskov how Moscow would respond to further American sanctions and what he really thinks of Joe Biden.
You don't know. Reframe.
Back now with the final part of my interview with Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov. Do you worry about the kind of sanctions that are being proposed? President Biden, I know, told President Putin in the phone call that these would be sanctions of a kind that are substantially more extensive than ever done before.
We understand that Washington is a great fan of introducing sanctions against different countries. And what was meant for the last kind of sanctions, this even sanctions, mentioning sanctions against the leadership of Russia. Well, of course, it's beyond our understanding. Potentially, this kind of sanctions can lead to discontinuation of any relationship between our two countries, which will not be in the interests of nor Moscow, neither Washington. It will be a great mistake. And of course, every time we would like to just to ask people in Washington, can you recall any example of a situation when sanctions helped you to solve a problem, where the sanctions were really effective in making a country to make certain steps? This never happened. This never happened. And we've got used to live under American sanctions, and to some extent we're trying to take advantage of them in terms of developing our domestic economy, our domestic production, compensating deficit of certain import parts and elements by producing our own, so it gives a boost to our national economy. So that's why, we're quite big and we're quite self-sufficient to be fragile against these sanctions. You have to understand it.
Let me ask you finally, Mr. Peskov. You've said some very generous things about President Biden. You've said he's one of the most experienced politicians in the world. You've said that he and President Putin have a good relationship. You've said that the negotiations have been started in good faith. Are you optimistic that things are going to de-escalate, that there is going to be some search for stability? Or are you pessimistic and feel things are spiraling downwards?
Well, I sincerely believe that the wisdom of our two leaders, political wisdom of President Putin and his political experience, and the political wisdom and experience of President Biden is a good soil for continuation of attempts to find a common ground. But there is a critical situation here. The critical situation is a situation around the concerns, national concerns of Russia. If we see a political will from Washington to try to take it into account somehow and to discuss it with us, then it's a common ground for continuation. If we continue to get response in the way that, no, it's out of question, we're not going to discuss it, then it will be a reason for being pessimistic.
All right, we will leave it at that. And it's always a pleasure to have you on, and I hope we can do this again.
It's my pleasure.
Next on GPS, how should the West respond to Russia's rhetoric and actions? I will talk to two former Western officials who have sat across from President Putin at the negotiating table. Their thoughts on Putin's threats when we come back. Contest many of the things that Mr. Peskov said, but the crucial question is, what should the West do? Radek Sikorski dealt with Vladimir Putin when he was Foreign Minister of Poland. He is currently a member of the European Parliament. Thomas Graham was involved in dialogues with Putin as the Senior Director for Russia at the National Security Council under George W. Bush. He is currently a Distinguished Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Tom, let me start with you. You heard the Peskov's line. Does it appear to you that they are preparing for war?
No, I don't think, well, first, yes, they are preparing for a military conflict. But I think that the preference at this point is to go down the diplomatic track. The steps that they've taken over the past several months, from the Kremlin standpoint, have been efforts to compel the United States to engage seriously on what they say their primary concerns are, which is basically the disposition of NATO forces in Europe and the expansion over the past 30 years. We've heard in recent days threats of escalation, the possible placement of Russian nuclear architecture in Cuba or Venezuela, for example. I think this is an effort to underscore that from the Kremlin standpoint, it's not only Ukraine's security that is at risk, it's not only Europe's, it's the United States. And the hope is that that will compel the United States to engage seriously on the range of issues.
Radek, how do you read the same situation?
Well, President Putin is an experienced and intelligent leader, but he is a gambler, and gamblers sometimes overreach. let's get something straight. I was at the NATO summit with President Putin in 2008 when we denied Ukraine a membership action plan. There are no NATO facilities or offensive weapons in Ukraine, and Russia is a nuclear power. Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal under the Budapest Memorandum of '94, in which Russia guaranteed Ukraine's borders and security. The idea of Ukraine being a threat to NATO, to Russia, is as absurd as Canada being a threat to the United States.
Tom, what Radek says is true, of course. Russia did guarantee that security. It does seem that it is trying to rewrite or roll back the concessions or the strategic reality that developed over the last 20 years, where NATO has moved to incorporate Poland and Hungary and countries like that in. How much give is there? Is there room, as I was asking, is there room for some kind of compromise here, you think?
No, I do think there's some room for compromise. I think what the Russian position is at this point is that we need to address the issues. Now, they have obviously laid out some extreme positions, almost in the form of ultimatums that are unacceptable to the West. The challenge, I think, for diplomacy is to thread the needle of our position that NATO retains an open door, that countries of the former Soviet Union, if they so desire, are free to associate with any countries in a military, political type of arrangement, and that includes NATO. On the other hand, Russia has made it quite clear that it needs to seek some sort of security buffer zone in Europe to feel secure. And the focus of this is obviously on Ukraine. What a colleague of mine, go ahead.
Radek, I wanted to ask you, we can talk about the United States more, but player here, or should be, would Europe back up a tough line against Russia? Right now, gas prices in Europe are sky high. Were there to be any kind of confrontation, sanctions against Russia, there would be a kind of energy crisis in Europe on the scale of the 1970s in the U.S. Are Europeans willing to deal with that? The German leadership, certainly, they're doing Nord Stream, which actually helps Russia, hurts Ukraine. I don't hear them being very strong right now. Where will Europe back the United States were it to be compelled to take a tough line?
I think President Putin was very surprised that Europe imposed sanctions for the invasion of Ukraine before, for taking over Crimea and for invading Donbass. And I think there would be consensus to increase them further. Remember, Russia also needs to sell us their gas. We can buy gas from the United States. Huge tankers are on their way now. We have LNG terminals. I think Russia needs to calculate that, for example, if she invades, Nord Stream 2 will never be operational.
Tom, do you think that fundamentally the best way to deal with this is deterrence or diplomacy? I mean, I realize there needs to be a combination of the two,
So that's right.
but at some level it feels like there's a tension here. The more you back Ukraine to strengthen it, to deter Russia, the more the Russians are going to feel that the U.S. is not listening to their concerns.
I think absolutely. We've done very well on the deterrence track so far. I think we need to do more on the diplomacy. And what I think we ought to get serious consideration to is something that I would call a moratorium on the further expansion of NATO eastward for a defined period, say 20 to 25 years. The period is not set in stone. That's a matter of negotiation. But the idea here is to have a period that's long enough so that the Russians can say that we have met our major security concern, which is about NATO's expansion eastward. This is a long enough period. It could be, in fact, forever. At the same token, we haven't compromised our view that the door to NATO is still open. And that means that we have to have a short enough period so that it doesn't look like we've given up or abandoned Ukraine.
All right. On that potential note of compromise, I have to close. We will doubtless be back with the two of you to discuss this because this crisis isn't going away. Thank you.